Hello and welcome to the latest Corny and Barrow wine podcast. I'm joined with probably our in-house Italian expert, which is very apt today, Mr. Hargrave. Hello.
Good morning. I'm wondering when we're going to do a podcast that's not about wine, Jay. That's crunchy and wine podcast. There we go.
Well, yeah, stay tuned for the series because it may well be something. And loves his Italian food, loves his Italian wine to a degree, but not necessarily your absolute passion, is it, as a region? But Mr. Eccles?
I mean, I used to be the Italian buyer for a different company back in the day.
Oh, there we go. So there is some relevance there.
Good that you know me well.
I've forgotten that CV post-interview a long time ago.
Yeah, but that particular company is still solvent before anyone gets worried that Mr. Eccles' Italian buying was disastrous.
Good.
Anyway, we're here today to talk about one of the, as a personality, one of the great people in the world of wine, but also one of the iconic wines of Italy. And we're going to be talking about Giacomo Conterno and also Roberto Conterno, the current owner and holder of Giacomo Conterno and his Nervi project in Gattinara. And we're going to be doing all sorts of chat, really. We're going to talk about the wines, the vintage, the new offer will be coming out soon. Roberto, obviously, he has his fingers in all sorts of pies, so I think we'll sort of touch upon those. And a little bit about Piedmont as well. We've all visited several times. It's, for me, probably one of... Actually, I'd argue, but I think I'm quite frequently will say and own up to the fact I think it's the most scenic, beautiful wine region there is, full stop.
Unquestionably agreed.
Oh, yeah. Right. That's nice. That's nice, right? We'll agree.
We agree.
Perfect.
First and only time we'll agree.
Yeah, that sort of patchwork of vineyards are just exceptional. Anyway, well, let's start with a very brief overview of a history of the estate. So, Roberto Conterno, he's very well known. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you'll already be quite familiar with Roberto and his reputation. So, it sort of started with his great grandfather Giovanni back in 1908. The family had a sort of small restaurant/inn in San Giuseppe. Giovanni started, and they basically just wanted to make a Barolo for it. So he was buying in grapes, and any he didn't use to make, he would sell on. And back then people would sort of share the juice and grapes to sort of make their own in-house wine. And he sort of got a little bit good at it, I guess. And, he started getting a little bit of reputation, I like to think, and there's a sort of a bustling development there. And then Giovanni passed away in 1934, and his son, Giacomo, took over, who had more of an interest and took it in a much more quality-focused direction. He started aging some of the wines for longer, which is obviously known as, the reserva is known as Monfortino within the Barolo range. And, the Monfortino does go back with his father, Giovanni, in 1920. I don't know if there was an older one, Will. The oldest I've probably seen is Monfortino's 1920. I
think that's right.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen older.
And anyway, so Giacomo took it into that direction, and he brought his two sons involved in 1961, which is Giovanni, again, just to confuse things, which is Roberto's father. So the Giovanni, his great-grandfather, and Giovanni, his father, and Giovanni's brother, Aldo Conterno. And people will know that name as well, because obviously there's Padero Aldo Conterno. And the two brothers basically split in 1969 and went different directions. Aldo, a little bit more sort of in tune with sort of trying to help modernize Barolo. Giovanni very much focused on the traditional elements and wanting to sort of keep those aspects going and championing them. So then we move forward, and Giovanni, his son is Roberto. One of the big things that Giovanni did to put it on a map was 1974. Then we move forward from 69 when the two brothers split. 1974, he bought Francia, 14-hectare piece of land in Serralunga d'Alba, so just on this very southern part of the valley. And out of that 14 hectares, it was originally a field of wheat or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So great foresight from Giovanni here. And 9.5 hectares roughly is Nebbiolo, 4.5 hectares is Barbera. Then things really pick up. The quality is excellent. The first Monfortino made purely from their own fruit only in Francia was 78. And we've got lots of great wines that have been produced from the estate since then. 2004, when Giovanni sadly passes away and Roberto steps up and takes full ownership. A bit like Giacomo, he was working with his grandfather post-war to get involved. Roberto was working very closely with his father for a long time before he sadly passed away. But in 2004, then Roberto takes the reins, so to speak, and his first purchase is in 2008 of Ceretta. So further north of Serralunga, right to the top of the valley, he picks up a 3-hectare parcel, 2 hectares Nebbiolo, 1 hectare Barbera. Then again, the bug hasn't left him. He picks up a little bit more, which makes complete sense here. It's an extension. Basically, he picks up Arione, 9 hectares of land, which is just below Francia.
Yeah.
So you've almost got a continuous strip, which I think is a fantastic move because we know what the wines are capable of producing there.
Yep.
Then we've got, then moving forward, he jumps into Gattinara, and Roberto starts in 2018, becomes owner of Nervi, which has got its own history, which we'll sort of maybe go into a little
touch
bit.
on that.
And then, this brings us to sort of modern times. That's where we're at. So look, I think that's the history done. I'll pass over to Will, because Will visited recently to see Roberto taste the wines that we're going to be offering, and no one knows him better than yourself at Corny Barrow.
Did you also cover Chiretta 08?
I did cover Chiretta 08.
Good. Sorry.
Asleep.
Thanks for paying attention. I mean, exactly. I know, keeping on your toes. No, I mean, I think Roberto, as you say, I've known him, I guess, for 20 years now, which is amazing, because I think we started in around about 05. And I actually remember Adam kept it very quiet at the time as to sort of the conversations, but I remember being on the sales floor at Thomas More Street and seeing Roberto being shown around without being introduced to anyone. And so I was immediately that afternoon, I emailed Adam and said, I'm pretty sure I know who that was. And if you need any help on that front, because I was obviously Italian mad by that point, and I don't still have the email because obviously it's probably been archived under GDPR or something ridiculous. But yeah, it was amazing. And so being able to work with him from the off's been incredible, really. And seeing the progression, I think it's interesting when you talk about the Alto Conterno, the sort of division of that. And I think what it's quite interesting to cover is the fact that we now see Piedmont and the wines of Barolo and Barbaresco as being highly in demand and as being put up there with Bordeaux and Burgundy. And this absolutely was not the case. I mean, they were struggling. One of the reasons probably that Aldo did that was that they were struggling to sell their wine. And even Conterno would have been struggling to sell their wine. Yeah. You hear all sorts of stories of people paying for one crop when they come to pick up the next one. And it was exactly as you mentioned, it was very much a negociant kind of business. Having your own vineyard. So people often like to say, well, traditional Barolo is one thing and modern is another. It's not really as simple as that, unfortunately, as almost everything in wine is never quite as simple as it might seem. But really uber traditional Barolo is made, for long maceration and then in big vats, but it also is a blend of different sites and it tends to be being bought in fruit, etc. And then people think of the most modern as being sort of single vineyard, aged in barriques, with more of an international flavour about that, which was a means to get the wine sold to a degree. And there are good modern producers as well as they're good traditional. But Roberto actually, in many ways, kind of sits right in the middle because he is uber traditional, but very precise when it comes to the winemaking and long aging, etc. Although, interestingly, the aging's come back for Monfortino about a year, from as much as 6 years back to 5 and even 4 sometimes. But he, in a way, is quite modern in that he's very much about single vineyard wines. So you have, Chiretta, Arione and Francia as the 3 sites, 2 of which have the Barbera, otherwise they don't. And then the same when you get up towards Nervi. So I think Roberto's character is all about precision and, sort of a slightly maniacal attention to detail, which makes it, as I always say in the offer of the year, about the only winery you could literally eat your food off the floor of. It's just bonkers.
It is so impressive. Yeah, I remember my first visit to the winery in Monforte d'Alba, and you go down the steps and you've got obviously all these huge botti with Nebbiolo aging quite happily inside, and you've got the stainless steel vats, and I just couldn't believe that this has been here for so long. It is spotless and remarkable, and it's all that sort of nice, sort of almost like it's terracotta colour. I know, but I'm not sure. Yeah,
absolutely,
and it's got this lovely feel. But to jump on what you were saying about Roberto and to support that sort of modern traditional, obviously, the winemaking side very much traditional emphasis, and I guess what we mean by that is letting Nebbiolo, the fruit, do the expression. Let the expression do the talking once the wine is open. You want freshness, you want aromatics, you want to have purity as much as possible of the fruit and particularly the land, the vineyards. And that's why single vineyard concepts obviously come with Roberto into that modern style. But it's also such an innovative character. It looks, you can do that with the glass range, which we'll come onto in a bit later on. He's got his sort of vineyard robot, which he's been sort of plugging away and developing. So he's always thinking about how he can move forward, and I do like that. And his, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but the sort of the OCD aspect of Roberto is very much a big positive because it makes him fastidious and meticulous on the winemaking side. But he's just applying that to all his new projects as well. But the downside of that is, I don't think I know anyone busier in the world of wine. It's almost impossible to pin him down for a dinner at times as well. But yeah,
and he does everything himself.
Yeah,
including he used to answer the phone, didn't he? Which was thank God he's got someone in as a secretary now. I think sort of the best way to explain that sort of difference between traditional and modern is almost at the moment that in certain ways the wheel has been reinvented in the best way. And you had that sort of new style that we talked about, using new oak barrels and that sort of that international style that really reached sort of its peak with producers like Vietti, who use sort of 100% new oak and want to go for that Reserva style to really get that oak in there. And now what you find with sort of the newer wave of producers is that tendency towards single vineyards, expression of Nebbiolo in itself rather than the oak, and therefore using large format and long macerations and fermentations. People like Roagna who really started working on that, and therefore they've sort of looked at that modern way, as you would call it, and gone back to the traditional ways in the best sense of the word.
Yeah.
And Roberto is at the forefront of that because, you can now see when you go to Barolo and when you taste across the region, a region that you used to just taste blends from, now you can tell that you are tasting something from Serralunga d'Alba because it is richer, it's bigger in style, the tannins take a little bit longer to come through, and you get that sort of clay richness that comes through in the wines compared to, say, Lamoro with more acidity, more perfume, and Verduno with sort of more intensity of black fruit.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I was actually thinking when Will was talking about that as well. Another example is Roberto Verzio. He started off super modern. He's now sort of changing a lot of his approach to Nebbiolo.
I think it's no great surprise that a lot of these guys and girls, and actually a lot of female winemakers in Piedmont, which is good, is that it's only a 4 hours drive, or if you're with Roberto, probably 3. Anyway, enough said about that one. To get to Burgundy. And they go to Burgundy a lot, and actually quite a lot of them. Italy is a massive market for champagne, and I think they love a lot of the grower champagne movement. And both Burgundy and grower champagne have this site thing and have this purity aspect that you really do see sort of playing out in Piedmont more and more. But I think you alluded to how beautiful the scenery is. I think you can't quite translate the vineyard specificity, for want of a less boring word, in Burgundy and Piedmont, because in Burgundy, essentially, and I'm going to sound like a complete heathen, you've really got one slope that takes you the whole way, and it's a matter of Grand Cru in the middle and Premier Cru above and below and Village. But in some of Piedmont, you actually have areas where there's 270 degrees of a little hillock.
Yeah.
All called the same vineyard, and that doesn't make sense at the same time. And one thing I learned when I was out there back in May was that actually, and I think this is going to be really interesting to see how they legislate this, but any bit of a vineyard in Barolo, it's probably the same in Barbaresco, but I can't vouch for that. But in Barolo, any north-facing bit of a vineyard cannot be Barolo. It has to be Langhe Nebbiolo. Now, as we see climate change, more and more of the time, and we'll come on to this with Frencher and Arione, people aren't so mad keen on fully south-facing, which they desperately wanted in the 70s and 80s to get ripeness. Now, they'd actually quite like a bit of north-facing. But if that means you can't call it Barolo and get the Barolo associated price, it'll be quite interesting to see whether we start to either see some very high-end Langhe Nebbiolos, and I would positively encourage people to try Langhe Nebbiolo as a way into to Nebbiolo more than the way into Barolo, funnily enough. But it'll be very interesting to see what they do with that over time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I wasn't particularly a favourite with Giacomo Conterno and Roberto until I came to Corny and Baron. Actually, hands up, my knowledge on Barolo was pretty limited. I would say after my sort of second visit, so circa around 2017, is when it all started falling for me after, doing a good week there with some friends. And that's, you then begin to understand. And because, I had my love for Burgundy and I could break down, appellations, valleys and the combe, the separate combe in Burgundy, etc. But when you get to Barolo and you see, and you can stand in the vineyards and you can go to the different valleys, whether it's Lamoro, you're talking about Serralunga, Monforte, Castiglione, you all of a sudden start to sort of try and associate different styles. And you can to a degree. You can't just, it's not as maybe as simple as telling the difference between a Chambol and a Nuit Saint-Georges, because there's a bit more crossover in Barolo. But there generally does tend to be a little bit more sort of, I think certainly where Monforte and Serralunga, where the vineyards for Roberto are, is all about that sort of Calcerist style. It's about purity. It's about that sort of expression, but with elegance. Now more slightly richer, perfumed, etc. But they are changing, and for me that was a really necessary education. And yeah, like you said, I think you've just got this sort of topography, and you've just got some aspects which are so sheer and so steep, and then other gradients which are so much smaller.
Yeah.
And now what I love as well is I actually think out of any fine wine region, you've probably got more, I think, vintage variation in Piedmont than you would find across a course of 10 years and maybe say in Burgundy and Bordeaux, which I think is fascinating, because if you get into loving these wines, what better adventure is there than a drinker is to have lots of different styles, which is generating, Nebbiolo is a great, far more hearty than Pinot. This kid can withstand heat, it can withstand a lot more things thrown at it. It wants a higher average temperature across the growing season than Pinot, for example. Almost can withstand sort of cab levels, and we know that because some people have tried to do it in the New World to varying degrees of success. And I think that's quite interesting. I think if you get into Nebbiolos and you get into certainly Barberas as well, it's a region you can have a lot of fun, and that will promise to probably continue for a long time. Yeah.
I think we said we sort of sum up at the end with sort of some vintages and things to drink.
Yeah. Well, so should we go through? So let's go through the offer, because what might be quite helpful is just to outline the wines that Roberto does, and just a sort of a general style. We can mention what the new vintage is, and
Well, should we start with? Well, let's start with Nervi. If we go
go in
reverse. It's also almost always the way that I do the trip is to go to Milan, and about 45 minutes west, you're straight into Gattinara. And so this is where Nervi, which exactly as you said, Roberto took over in 18. It's interesting to note that actually he knew the previous owners who were Norwegian, who actually have a tiny share still because they're great friends of Roberto's. So Roberto had, and we don't use this in the literature, and so it's a bit of a sort of an insider thing, but he'd been going up there for 7 or 8 years, totally unpaid, as a friend. He used to go skiing and things with the guys as well, just to help out and give them some views. So he had a little bit of a run-in to knowing what was going on, but he completely looked, and no one takes on a building project quite like Roberto, and getting things done. I mean, almost sort of getting projects finished during COVID in Italy. It shows you quite how driven and organised he is.
Huge transformations. I remember we went before and after. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, massive. So, but I think what's been really interesting is that Gattinara, and you have a lot of other places in the Alto Piemonte. This used to be, I think I'm right in saying, and there used to be masses of vineyards in Gattinara. And then what really basically happened is that as things, industrial revolutions, and then as people moved more and more to the factories, Milan being a big city and local, a lot of people were like, why am I flogging my guts out 70 hours a week to make wine that I'm struggling to sell when I can move 45 minutes to Milan and work in a factory? And, quite scary to think that these days, but that was the harsh reality. And so Gattinara, from its pomp to where it is now in terms of vineyards, is kind of about 10-15% of what it was at its main. But that means you're left with the quality. It's also quite interesting, you got Gattinara as a town, the second biggest Lavazza factory in the world. So the whole place smells quite coffee-ish. I think it'd be 7 million capsules a day. Anyway, it's a sort of fact I can't help but remember. But yeah, the wines are gorgeous. And one thing I never thought, and I think I've said this in previous offers, but if there was anyone I didn't ever think would make a rosé, then it would be Roberto. I thought this is a frivolous summer wine. But there'd been one at Nervi. And so the Rosato, it has been there from the off. And actually, it's a really, really successful wine for us. I love it. It's clear bottle, screw cap. It's a nice, quite leery label, but it's an absolutely cracking drink. And it's a Nebbiolo, 100% Nebbiolo rosé. I absolutely love drinking it. Yeah, obviously sort of refreshingly cool, but actually, and I can hear almost Adam sort of rolling his eyes because he likes these things served very cold, but actually you let it come up to sort of what I would call white burgundy temperature, and it's a juicy, cracking rosé. So that's been something that's amazing. I'm endlessly petitioning Roberto to do it in magnums, but he says if he does that for us, he'll have to do it for everyone. I don't really see the problem with that. There we go.
It's picked up a very low following here amongst our customers as well. Less than 4,000 cases.
And it's lovely. And because it's screw cap, it stays fresh as a daisy. I've had bottles of, I think we had 1 or 2 bottles left of 21 and 22 recently, and I've had those and they're absolutely delicious. So there's that. But then I think before we get on to where people are probably expecting us to go, the other thing Roberto is an absolute, as I sort of alluded to, people go to Champagne a lot. He loves Champagne, and probably his two favourite Champagne houses would be opposite ends of the scale in a way, it'd be Krug and Salon. But he does the Jefferson, which is a sort of nod to the famous American, obviously, that he used to go to Piedmont quite a lot. And back then,
particularly to Gattinara as well.
Yeah, and back then, a lot of the Nebbiolo would have been light and sparkling. Just made in a very flippant, I was going to say, but, made in a sort of quick and easy way. But they had one at Nervi, but Roberto was absolutely mad keen to carry this on. And I think said, we'll do a couple of thousand bottles every year and that's it. I think he's got more and more excited by it. So I think production relatively soon will be about 20,000 bottles in a bottle that looks now from the 19, looks quite Krug-like, it has to be said. But it's absolutely delicious and served in his own sparkling glass, which we'll probably come on to later.
I remember when we first tried that, we arrived.
He just gorged it into a bucket.
He absolutely just did the full sabering, in this lovely restaurant, just sitting above the lake, gorgeous sunshine. We were absolutely sweating.
It was boiling.
Yeah, and we got out and, he just went, we've got the perfect starter for you, perfect aperitif. And then he pulled out a bottle and we thought, okay, yeah, lovely. And then he proceeds to sabre it himself. Like, okay, this is, the Roberto's just going a bit more extreme. But then we realised there wasn't necessarily a label on it. And it turns out it was just straight from the cellar that he'd made.
It's an amazing restaurant, restaurant hotel derby. Which is actually was designed by the guy who's one of Roberto's great mates, who's his architect, which again, with restaurants and Nervi, and we'll probably cover. But yeah, it's cracking to have that, and I think it's really, really interesting. I think Roberto's going to age a little bit of it just to see what happens. But yeah, we're releasing. I think I'm right in saying 17 and 18 were the first two sort of modern renditions of it, or his renditions, and were both good. I think there is a considerable step up with 19 and then 20. Yeah. So yeah, I'd urge people to give that a go. But then
the real focus is the Nebbiolo.
Well, they're new to Nebbiolo. So essentially there are three Nebbiolo. Well, essentially there are only three Nebbiolos that he does in Gattinara. There's the straight Gattinara. So you're thinking of a village wine, no different from Gevrey-Chambertin or, Chambord, Mazzini Village, whatever. And then he has Valfarana and Molsino, which are released as single vintages 1 year later. So this year we're doing 21 and 22, but so he doesn't always. There've been a couple of vintages when he hasn't made the single vineyards, not so much as we'll come on to with Monfortino later, not so much because of quality, but if they don't show the character he's expecting, then he'd rather roll them all in and make the Gattinara straight. But yeah, they're brilliant. I mean, Molsino is a natural amphitheatre. We'll try and get some photos into the offer and things, but and it's just a wonderful, and he's done a little bit of replanting. Valfarana is a little bit across from there, a little bit of valley, and as the Farana bit suggests, is a little bit more ferrous. So Molsino tends to be a little bit more velvety, a little bit smooth is the wrong word, but a little bit more tender,
on aromatics.
Yeah, and aromatics and tenderness, and Valfarana a little more of that sort of iron core, but.
Yeah, I think always Valfarana feels a little bit more elegant but persistent to me. I took it 2019 to a lunch a couple of months ago, and you have this. We have high aromatics from the wine syrup. You've got to remember, if you drive through all these small regions around there, Gattinara is the highest point, and it feels a little bit more refreshing on a hot day. You drive through places like Sizzano and you are absolutely baking hot, and then you get up to Gattinara and there's a lot more freshness. You can feel the alpine air coming down. Yeah. So that is why I think that in the wines you have a little bit more higher aromatics, a little bit more higher acidity. Yeah. It makes them great to be able to drink a tiny little bit earlier. Yeah. But at the same time, they age well because they have lovely tannins from Nebbiolo there. But yeah, for me, like a nice little comparison to have Valfarana for lovely, elegant, almost like chalky style Nebbiolo. And then you have the Molsino, which gives you that mouth coating tannins. They're
I think it's a very good way.
Vignettes.
Yeah, really very good wines.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite nice as well. I mean, I think with aging it'd be quite interesting because when you talk about, you've got that sort of ferrous oxide in the soils, which tends to give a sort of a roundness to the palate. It always takes me back to things like Trotton Noir, which has got that sort of that big component in half of its soil composition. And that's what I love about that, which with age it brings around that. So I would really like to try Valfarana with age. It's coming,
And also I think the vintage variations are aren't massive, but they are definite.
Yeah.
21 which is where the single vineyards come from this time, did have some frost and was smaller as a result, hence why Gattinara 21 last year, the village was less. The Gattinara 22, the straight Gattinara, the village wine, is absolutely gorgeous. And like a lot of 22s around Europe, it was warm. They're fine for rain and things there. Although, interestingly, it's a lot drier there than down in Piedmont because they're right in the sort of just under the sort of bit of going up towards the Alps.
Yeah.
So you get that thing of where, the air moves around a lot there, I would agree, but it doesn't get rained on a massive amount. And there are vintages, Roberto, I remember at the time, used to say with 18, he definitely thinks that it's 18 suited Gattinara more than it suited Barolo Barbaresco. So there are differences. And you're also talking, I know people think, Piedmont's Piedmont, but it's still an hour and a half's drive. Or closer to 2 to get from Gattinara to Monforte where the winery is for the Barolos. So, that's not an insignificant, we don't think of, I don't know, London and Bristol as being in the same place, and it's a similar scenario.
Yeah, completely. I mean, if you drove from Chablis down to Merceau, it's a completely different style of wine, and you do feel sort of the difference in the climate as well. So two separate things that should be praised for sort of their individuality.
Yeah. And my sort of 2 pence on the offer is if you're already a fan of Roberto's wines and you haven't really taken a deep dive into Nervi's side, now is the time. You should be doing this because I can't emphasize enough the amount of money that he's put into in restructuring all of the cellar, in totally changing how the wines were made to the previous owners. The step up in quality is exceptional. It's incredibly significant. Similar ethos, obviously, to what he's doing within traditional Barolo, applying it to Gattinara, but tweaking in line with what's best for those vineyards. But the step up is phenomenal. And if I was to think about, so Domaine Leflaive, we all know possibly one of the greatest white wine producers there are. They have Esprit Leflaive. Now, a slight difference is, Esprit, okay, they don't necessarily own, but they do work the vineyards. They do a Chablis. And their Chablis Fourchaume is exceptional. It's almost saying, well, I don't want to buy the Chablis Fourchaume from Esprit or Leflaive. I'll just stick to the Pliny. And, it's bonkers to go along that line of thinking. Everyone who's jumped in, we've served that blind to a lot of fanfare. It's the same thing. Look, do have a little
play with it.
Yeah, have a little play with these wines because they're superb. But then, let's bring it back to Barolo then now, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, well, then we'll cover restaurants a little bit later.
Yeah.
But yes, and we did this way around as I normally do. Yeah, as I said, it's a couple of hours drive down to the winery in Monforte. So to clear up any confusion there, Monfortino obviously is because the wines were made in Monforte. They still are made in Monforte. Slightly ironically, Roberto doesn't own any land in Monforte d'Alba. All of the vineyards are in Serralunga.
Except the winery.
Sorry, and the winery is in Monforte, so it's slightly odd. But goes to show you that whole thing we were talking about the negotiable side of things. That was where they were based. But anyway, it's a very quick drive. I mean, you're talking about probably 10, 12 minutes to get from the winery to Arione and Francia, which are next door to each other. Oh, yes, Arione being the addition in 15, exactly as you said. And then you probably have another 5 or 6 minutes drive north of Francia to get to Cerreta. And I think maybe to talk about the differences between that, because it can sometimes get a bit confusing for people as to which wines are made where and what comes from where, etc. And on that point, there's a very good website run by an American guy called Fine Wine Geek, and he has a whole section on what was made when and which was, anyway, Ken Vastola, I think he's called anyway. But it's not a very modern looking website, but it is up to date and it's very useful for that.
It is useful.
But one thing I find fascinating is that the differences between so there are 2 Barberas Roberto makes, and he has Barbera in Cerreta and Barbera in Francia. Exactly as you said, in Francia about 4.5 hectares, and in Cerreta 1. Okay, but the differences in style between the two vineyards is every bit as marked. I would argue possibly even more marked in Barbera than it is with the Nebbiolos. And so whilst Francia and Arione, Roberto plays with which goes into which wine and what happens with Monfortino, and therefore it's a continuous vineyard. Ceretta has never, and Roberto insists would never go into Monfortino.
Yeah.
It's clay soil. It's a little bit plusher in a way, I think is one of the words. The Barbera can be a little bit more lifted, a little bit more cranberry, a little bit more cherry, whereas you always have this sort of slight saltiness to the Francia wines, and a sort of a red strawberry, grey pepper, and a little bit of salt is kind of my signature for Francia. So those are the sites, and both the Barberas I think it's fair to say are the leading Barberas that there are. There are a lot of different styles of Barbera now. These are not necessarily the lunchtime Barbera style. I'm not going to pretend they are. There's quite a lot of matter about them, quite a lot of seriousness. I think, as I put in the guide of what to drink when type thing, I think 5 to 10 years is an absolutely cracking window. You can keep them longer, and I've had older Barberas, but actually they become less interesting, if I'm totally honest. They take on a little bit more soy and iodine and those kind of characters. But I love the Barberas. I think they're a cracking drink.
Any reason why he's never made a dolcetto?
No, I just don't think that there's been a dolcetto in any of the vineyards they've bought.
Okay.
He's certainly not sort of anti it, and Fraser obviously is another variety that they have, but no, I'm not sure. I mean, there may have been, because back from when they were negotiable, there may have been bottlings of dolcetto back in the 50s and 60s, because there certainly were Barbarescos from Conterno and all sorts of things way back.
On the Barbera as well, I'd say my thoughts here, they do age nicely. I'd say Francia tends to age. I think if you are looking for that sort of sweet spot with a little bit of tertiary development, a little bit of structural change, a little bit of the fruit profile calming down, and a bit more harmony within. Generally speaking, my rule is Francia, leave it a little bit longer than Ceretta. So I'd be interested if you agree with that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I agree. Love the wines to the extent where, I don't know if you recall, but my wedding wine was Ceretta 08 Barbera. And that was in 2011 when Mrs. Muller unfortunately had to get permanently hitched to myself.
Yeah,
life sentence.
She still gets.
Thank you for that, Jess.
Almost monthly medals for that one. Yeah, so there's that. The only other slight quirk of history was that when Roberto first started in both 08 and 09, he released what could have been called a Barolo in Ceretta. He released that as a Langhe Nebbiolo because he just didn't want to give it the Barolo label until he was sure, but it's a cracking wine, so one to look out for. Which probably leads us on into Nebbiolo
territory. Yeah. So the three vineyards, I think, are sort of. Yeah, what would you say the main difference between Arione and Francia? Because that's probably the trickier one, and those who are very much into these wines will want to explore.
I think I had to hold my hands up and say it's tricky to know that really now, because 15 was the first Arione Roberto's made. He was very happy with the state of the vineyard when he bought it. And obviously he bought it amongst quite a lot of competition, but they sensibly had the rule that you have to offer it to your neighbour first. So that's how Roberto got the option.
Oh, that is good.
Although when he got it, he did have a wonderful wind-up with Adam and rang Adam up and said, I've just sold the entire winery to a rich American. What do you think of that? And Adam didn't quite know what to say. And then Roberto, no, I'm joking. Because it was around the time of the sort of... Yes, it was around the time of that.
Imagine if I had the same rule of that in Burgundy. What a happy place it'd be.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how you come up with the price. But anyway, so I think quite similar. Arione is pretty much full south facing. So it continues, whereas Francia's more southwest facing, and as it comes round the bottom, you've got the south face. So it can be quite full, quite rich. I think what's really interesting, and we talk about this because it leads us perfectly on into the next wine, which is a little bit of an outlier, purely through an oddity of the ruling. So the Nebbiolo d'Alba, the Vigna Arione 22.
Yeah.
So of the holdings that Roberto has in Arione, there is 2.2 of the, in total it's 5.8, but 2.2 of the hectares are actually outside. The vineyard's continuous, but they are outside the Barolo region. So cannot be released as either Barolo or even a Langhe Nebbiolo. They have to be released as a Nebbiolo d'Alba. It's not really, it makes very little difference, but it is released 1 year earlier, so hence why we've got the Nebbiolo 22 in here. It's a bit weird, but I suppose it's one of these arguments where a line has to be drawn somewhere. And when they did the rules, it probably didn't make a massive amount of difference. Now, financially, I guess Roberto would far rather it was all called Barolo, but, he's not going to lose any sleep over that. But then you've got the 3.6 hectares, which are in Arione and called Barolo Arione.
Yeah. For the enthusiast, it's a little gem because, it's less expensive than Arione straight up. It's a year younger, so it's a different expression, but of quite similar terroirs. Great to do a little vertical at some point where you can do Nebbiolo d'Albas versus the actual Barolo as well.
Oh, totally. I mean, and I've had, I got to try this time, which Roberto very kindly opened the 15. I think he only did as a charitable bottling, which was quite fun to taste that. But it's a little, because it's a year earlier release, and I think because they pick a tiny bit earlier, than the rest of the vineyard for Arione, it's a little bit more tender. But I mean, it's juicy and pretty good. I mean, I gave it 18, and it's also one you could age, but there's nothing wrong. I mean, I've had 20 and 21 of that recently, and I absolutely loved it. Yeah. So it's not something that insists on being kept.
So, I mean, that brings us to the Barolos themselves, and there's a lot of excitement here because it's 2021.
Yeah, so we've got a lot to play with here because I think for the first time in a long time, I can't remember exactly, we've got all of the wines in this offer. So 21, very fabled vintage. There will be, which we'll come on to, there will be a Monfortino in 21. So it's not one of those vintages where all of French has gone into Monfortino, which did happen in 19, which we'll come on to. But 21, I mean, it was a pretty classic vintage for them. I mean, classic in a very positive sense. It's a really weird vintage 21 when you look at it, because as I think I've tried to articulate in the offer, there's a big line across Europe in 21. And basically Spain, Piedmont, Tuscany, and sort of, I suppose, south of the Alps, if you were to draw a line across from the bottom of the Alps, they had a long, really quite good, quite warm, but not too crazy hot, cracking vintage. And above that, as we know from Burgundy and from
frosts and
there was almost Champagne, almost nothing. When you go across to Bordeaux, it was a tricky vintage. You had frosts, so it's a really weird one as to that. Very different from 22, for instance, or 2020 or 19, where you had a sort of uniformity across Europe. I think odd thing to say, but 21 has a real combination of both finesse and long-livedness. So I think, and it suits a wine merchant to say this, but I think they are wines that are going to be absolutely gorgeous from the off. But I mean, they have the profundity to be seriously aged. So.
I like it when you don't have that sort of homogenous spread across Europe, because we've had so many vintages of that. It's not that it's dull, but it's a very common theme with climate change. But I mean, I think you also, we will talk about 19 in a moment with Monfortino, but you've got, and you say in your writing on the offer, Will, 19 is that sort of quite traditional style of a growing season, and that's resulted in that sort of Nebbiolo with backbone, of course, high acid, but packed well in
it likes a lot of long hang time. Nebbiolo. So it likes the idea that it's picked in October and even into November, but it doesn't really happen.
And they've made wines that are going to be really need some patience, and they're going to come around. That high acid profile. Then 20, you've got a more plush style. That sort of did share with the rest of Europe, but that sort of warm patches that came in, soft and tannins, so you'd feel it structurally there, acid slightly low, but then a hint of sucrosity across Nebbiolo. Then 21, almost as a lazy expression, if you like, combines the two, where you've got structure, precision, focus, you've got phenolics that are in a really good place, which are going to show ageability, but they've also been ever so slightly softened, that if you want to pull the corks early, you're going to get some degree of charm. Now, obviously, that might be a case where with a lot of great fine reds is if you want that charm in a vintage, which is such a brilliant year, you need to pull the cork soon, within a couple of years, because then it's going to start closing down. And I imagine some of them may go through that journey, obviously. But so we've spoken about Arione and Francia's differences. I think Ceretta as a Barolo, you can almost sort of apply a little bit of the logic. I totally agree with you. I think in Barbera, they're more distinctive, the differences. But again, you do have a bit more of a slightly flamboyant fruit profile in Ceretta with the Barolo as well, which I think is that clay character that you mentioned as well coming through versus big calcareous deposits which you get in.
Yeah, just looking at it, I did find it kind of succulent, and the plushness that I mentioned is right. I just don't see any logical reason why it'll close down and have a sulk at any point. I think it'll be pretty top.
Well, that's great
all the way through. So Monfortino.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the few instances of where, The first time it's been all of Arione Barolo went into it. So the production is far more generous, which is wonderful. It's also really weird because of the fact that it's the first Monfortino since 16, 17, 18. I think 17, 18, everyone logically not that surprised there wasn't a Monfortino. Decent vintages, but not maybe quite as profound. 16, I think people were very confused about. And financially, if Roberto were purely financially driven, there would have been a Monfortino 16. There's absolutely no question about that. Great vintage, probably seen as the greatest vintage pre-21 and, the last great vintage. But he didn't find it distinct enough. But from 15 and 19, you have this whole Arione in there as well. And I've tasted it several times, which has been wonderful. So a couple of times from barrel, and then obviously it's been ready to go for a bit, but they've actually kept the balance of when they release it. So we've gone from a trio of non-Fortinos of 16, 17, 18, and now we have a trio of Monfortinos coming with 2019, 2021.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a hell of a wine. And Roberto has always said this phrase, and I can't really escape it, but you do sort of, there's a chewiness to Monfortino and a sort of seriousness. And people have often said, there wouldn't always be a time when I would pick Monfortino over say French or Chiaretta, because I think they're kind of different things, and I think that's true. And I think Monfortino is arguably one of the last great sort of bastions of tradition at its very best. It's long aged. It's got uber defined tannins, and it's I just absolutely love it. And having had 14 and 15 quite recently, I think the 19 will be best aged, but I don't think you're going to have to wait crazy amounts of time before, I think by its 10th birthday, you'll be able to really, really enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to draw back attention to Roberto, and, his decision-making is all what he genuinely feels is the best for the estate in making the best possible wines. And, you get that great example of 16 not being made. Just to sort of refresh most people, or if you're sort of listening or investigating, the wines for your own sort of research purposes before actually trying them the first time, Monfortino is normally a barrel selection. So, it's not specific plots. And then, that's why Roberto's always tasting, deciding which ones are best. And that's where he can, a little bit later decide, actually, no, we're not doing Monfortino this year because it hasn't hit the level that I want it to hit and reflect. So yeah, to have a 19, obviously across French and Arione, must have just been spectacular. For every barrel to be showing at the level that he wanted to make it reserva, age it for longer and release is brilliant. But it also reminds me of, which is, and actually we can segue into drinking vintages, and I'm going to start with Monfortino, but 2002.
Yeah.
He went, okay, maybe nature dealt it, but it emphasizes Roberto's reaction, his thoughts and understanding of the land and everything that plays into making such a great wine. There was a hailstorm that came across. A lot of vineyards were really decimated. Big part of Francia really was unscathed, and they managed to survive. And he tasted as it went through past, during the élevage process, during that, you can feel this incredible wine. And this is when he was with his dad was around as well. And he sort of alluded to his dad wasn't necessarily sure about, and obviously when he made the final decision, his dad had passed away. But to release O2, when no one else was doing any O2, a lot of them were either being blended, declassified, and it is spectacular. And, I love that. And he just championed it. And it's probably one of the best ones to drink now.
Yeah. The pure only Monfortino vintages obviously have been 02, 14 and
now 19,
but it was one hell of a decision.
Yeah. Have you guys, what have you drunk from the stable, if you like, that you'd like to highlight?
I have to firstly say that my first taste of a C&B wine was Monfortino.
Oh, hello.
The top. Top of the pops.
It was 1995, and it was poured for me by some wine merchant who eventually hired me for a job 9 years later when we were in Newcastle. Do you remember?
Indeed. Okay. Yes. Right. God, yeah.
And it was completely stunning in a lineup that contained some Bordeaux first growths that, at that time, I'd only ever heard of these wines and never tasted them. It was just fantastic that this Monfortino 95 was sort of standing out with, the tannin shape was just immense. So that went quite well with a Côte de Boeuf, but memories faded now. After, I think that was 9 years ago. As I said, recently I've been enjoying the Gattinara Valfaranas. I had a couple of 08 Chiaretta Barberas, the sort of first release.
Yeah. My wedding wine.
They were still they were really enjoyable. You get
probably quite
yeah, as you said, Will, that sort of soy and and sort of spice to them. But I would be tucking into 19, 20 Barbera at the moment. They're delicious and just in the right spot.
Yeah, no, I agree. I had a Francia 21 Barbera recently, but I mean, I think it's quite interesting. I think one thing I would carry over from Burgundy again is with the Nebbiolos, so the Barolos, is that the warmer vintages served a bit cooler makes a big difference. I'm not a massive long-term decanter of Nebbiolo. People will say, oh, you decant it in the morning to drink it in the evening, all this sort of stuff. I think treat it as you do top Burgundy, which is, for my mind, maybe in the morning or as many hours before as you can. Check the bottle, and then I just leave it standing up with a tiny bit taken out of the top, and that tends to work really nicely for me. It doesn't throw. Barbera does throw a big sediment, so Barbera is often worth standing up for a bit and then having a quick decant of before you drink it, purely to avoid having a sort of gritty mouthful at the end. But Nebbiolo doesn't throw. It's a thin-skinned grape variety. Doesn't throw masses of sediment.
So on the drinking front for me, I mean, I'll start just quickly with Monfortino because I think it's just some people that will want to hear about that, of course. And there's two legendary vintages, certainly, with 2010 and 2004, and they're both way too young. There's just no point opening them. And I was served a 4 in March, and it was glorious, but it was this, and you can appreciate it, of course you can, but if you've got a 6-bottle case or even 1 bottle in reserves or the cellar at home, my advice there is just to wait. Tight. Yeah, just to get the best out of it. So yeah, 02 I think is probably for me the youngest, where it's really showing a sort of a nice spectrum of age. And I really like 929. I think it's showing there's a softness there which is unexpected around it, which is interesting, and I think is worth looking at. Then some of the 90s certainly go through, but one that's properly into its stride is 1990. I'd also like to say, I think possibly the best one I've had full stop from, the combination of the company, the meal itself, where the wine was at, was Francia 90. That Barolo Francia 90 is just an absolute humdinger, yeah. And moving forward from that, Francia 07, 09, I think are both beautiful. The 2010 is superlative. It's quite incredible. What it does make me want to try, which I haven't since it's been made, is Ceretta 10 yet. I still...
The first Barolo?
Yeah, the first one. It wasn't Magnum only, was it, from memory?
I don't think...
No, I think
I ought to. Well, I ought to know.
But yeah. So I would like to try that. But I mean, yeah, those, I agree with you. I think some of the warmer vintages are really fun to try. 13s, though, they're quite nice to try now, just with, if you like that sort of real fresh, high acid zing, which still has an aromatic play, so some florality and some fruit. But obviously there's going to be quite a relatively compact and present structure on the mouth.
Looking back on the 19, I just wanted to check before I said it, but Roberto did liken the season in 13 and 19. He likened as being quite similar.
Oh, cool.
Which is an interesting bit. I mean, I also think if you're looking at any of the Barolos, actually, it would just be Francia and Monfortino, but don't discount. I totally agree. 04 and 10 are seen as sort of leisurely vintages, and that's quite right. But I've always, across the region, but particularly Roberto's ones, adored 06 and 08. I think
08, yeah.
6. And lazy analogy, but 6 is maybe the slightly more muscular, slightly more masculine style, and 8 is slightly more feminine and tender and poised. But they are cracking vintages and not to be ignored at the expense of paying more for 04 or 10. If I'm totally sort of blunt on that.
Secondary market buys now. 08 is the buy at the moment. Its price is excellent,
and you can drink it now or in 10 years. There's an absolute choice to that.
Versus the other vintage Monfortino, it's a really good price. There's a bit of a snip to it.
But yeah, I think what we're saying at the nub of it is just get bottles open and try these things, and don't be afraid to open the wines. Nebbiolo is not what it was, which is sort of belt and braces, and you need to wait 10, 15 years, 20 years before even touching it. It's just not the case. Particularly when you've got a nice glass to drink it out of, Mr. Wheeler.
Yeah, indeed. Well, a nice glass and in a nice restaurant. I mean, there's two things about it. I hope you've enjoyed the sort of the deep dive on the wine side, but I think we should probably talk about sensory glasses for a little bit. And also, Roberto likes his food. He's got 2 restaurants, one with Nervi at the estate, and one in La Mora.
What was called Restaurant Bovio and is now Belseat in Langer, with one of the great views of any restaurant anywhere. Frankly, it's unbelievable. And he's got this amazing glass that I actually had to walk up to and touch to believe was there. It is, and we were there on about the second or third day that he'd properly opened this extra private dining room bit. Absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah.
But also, what is also interesting, and this is where Roberto takes his position, sort of unofficial position as one of the sort of higher profile producers of the region, is that at both restaurants he has amazing wine lists of other producers in the region, priced really well. It's not me saying that, I've seen it on endless blogs and things like that. So yeah, the two sites, I mean, they're very different. So Belsita in Langer, which is just below La Mora, is refined but very classical Piedmontese dishes, things like vitello tonato will always be on there, but amazing seafoods and meats and pastas, and it's just absolutely brilliant. But really done really smartly, not going looking necessarily for sort of stars and stuff, but at a very high level. And then you have a Cucina Nelvi up in Gattinara, is firstly an amazing bit of wood that sort of sits around the open kitchen. Quite a small restaurant, maybe 25, 30 covers, but the food is Italian produce and Italian inspired, but there's a big leaning on Japan as well. Real precise, quite a few courses, really good fun, great list. So yeah, I'd thoroughly recommend both. Very different experiences. I mean, when you go through Gattinara, it's quite a rustic town. It's sort of not pretending to be particularly swanky in any way, shape, or form. A little bit sort of down at the mouth in a funny sort of way. But the food there could not be less like Gattinara itself.
Nice.
But yeah, no, it's brilliant.
Well, whilst before we go on, because I'd like to actually hear for any other restaurant recommendations. I always think it's quite fun to throw some of them out to listeners who might go there already or be thinking about it. But the glasses, so sensory glass, I use at home. The two glasses I serve from the most at home are Salto Burgundy and Sensory. And I've got a preference for Sensory. I'll probably use them more. I love the shape. I love the weight.
I probably use Alto Bordeaux and Sensory.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're brilliant. And I think they work for pretty much everything. And then the Symphony glass, which is much less well known, but is Roberto's sparkling glass.
Yes.
It's actually taller than the Sensory, which looks slightly odd at times. But yeah, they're both cracking, and they'll be in the offer. But Sensory seems to be getting some real momentum. You see it in quite a lot of restaurants, around now, not just in the region. It's really grown a bit.
Well then, okay. Well, before we close, and I know it's been a long one, but we thought it was time that we did a bit of an in-depth.
Well, maybe you have to come back and talk about Blackshire, the vineyard robot. But
we'll do that later.
Yeah, and Roberto also made his own ski. So in his spare time, he has about 2 days holiday a year, I think. There you go. We can cover that later. But restaurants you were going to mention.
Yeah, Mr. Eccles, have you got any favourites in the region?
Yeah, I'm going to go really simple. My favourite place for agnolotti in the region is Ristorante Brezza, which is in the Hotel Barolo. It is the best place if you want to go for just a bowl of agnolotti. Nice list as well. You can get stuck in there. And yeah, I've tried to replicate at home making agnolotti so many times, and I cannot get it even close to that.
I had my biggest ever Venus show-off dinner there that I will never forget, when Gianfranco Soldera took us to meet Beppe Rinaldi, and Roberto was there as well. And Beppe turned up in his little Mini and all sorts. And given that both Beppe and Gianfranco have now passed, it's always I just wish we'd taken a decent picture. But it's a cracking, completely unshowy restaurant. Just brilliant.
Yeah, if you just want to go for, I think for the agnolotti, it's something like €15, €17. Yeah, it's cheap as anything. It's so good.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my peasant.
That's when you go with. Oh yeah, the great food, Mr. Tiger.
Osteria Veglio is brilliant, really, really, really good. I love the two brothers at Coccinella, Coccinella is quite an autumnal restaurant to go to.
Yeah.
It's a sort of bit of a dinner fireside type restaurant, but absolutely cracking. But Il Posto, there are a lot, and I think, as with a lot of Italy, you don't have to go flash. I would totally agree with Brett, that you'd said. But there are lots of other good places that aren't particularly showy, where you can just get such good food.
Yeah. Well, I'll go for some particularly lunchtime. So one of my favourites is Trattoria della Posta, which is just outside of Forte.
Yeah.
And they've got this sort of lovely outside terrace for al fresco. I mean, you can obviously go there for dinner.
The biggest menu I think I've ever seen. It's like size A1.
Yeah, it's massive. Yeah, but great pasta, and I've got a great memory of a really nice, well-priced list. Last time I missed there was pre-COVID. I haven't been there since then, about around 18, 19. But I loved it there, and especially if you get the right day. Then also, this is on the posh side, but it's quite cool, and particularly for lunch better than dinner, which is Ciao di Tonaventi.
Yeah.
It's got an amazing wine cellar downstairs, which is well worth the tour.
Over at Barbaresco.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, Barbaresco way. And it's got, again, a lovely sort of terrace, but it's Michelin starred, but the view is spectacular.
And if you book far enough in advance, ask to have an aperitif downstairs in the cellar.
Oh, nice.
Ciao di Tonaventi, it's very cool. Yeah.
But
don't have an afternoon appointment after a lunch.
No, indeed.
Ciao di Tonaventi, you need to go back and have a snooze before dinner.
And the other one if you're looking for sort of the fine dining, I think is Guido. People, that's probably Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we clearly have motored as best as we can through that. There's a lot of content. So this is a deep dive series. This should be called for Corny and Barrow podcasts on Conterno, Giacomo Conterno and Nervi. But it's been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, chaps.
Great to chat with you as always, Muller.
Indeed, Mr. Muller. Yeah, no, very good. And I think we'll come back to more Italian ones.
Yeah. Okay.
For sure.
Cheerio.
Cheers.
Well done.